Welcome to KBcast, the podcast for security executives, interviewing people from around the globe on how organizations can operate smarter and stay safer. Here's Carissa Breen.
I sat down with the gregarious Chris Pogue from Nuix, and I absolutely loved this conversation about his tenure in the industry and his thoughts towards certain topical conversations. We discussed leadership and his beliefs on where the industry is headed and where he believes we need to be. Chris touches on his book that he's currently writing, as well as his coaching for CISOs and how he helps them evolve as leaders. If you're keen to learn more about Chris and his thoughts, then this episode is for you, so please keep on listening. So, Chris, you and I spoke a few months back. We were actually supposed to meet in Sydney in person, but then, of course, COVID happened and you had to fly back to the US. So I can totally understand and appreciate that that was a thing that you had to do. And when we did speak, you mentioned a lot of things that I personally think about and a lot of the viewpoints that I share as well. So I'm really keen to get into those. But before we get into your experience, I'd really love for you to talk to our audience about your journey. So can you start off to tell our listeners about where you started to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, Carissa. It's an honor to be one of your guests. And so hopefully what we have to go over will be valuable in someone else's journey. So my journey into the IT space began about 23 years ago as an artillery sergeant in the United States Army. A whole lot of fun, making things go boom, not a lot of jobs on the market for explosive specialists. And my wife, really not a big fan of explosives and firearms, wanted me to find a job that I wouldn't have an opportunity to detonate myself or get shot. And so we really looked into IT, and I reflagged in the Army, right? That just means I changed jobs. I moved into what's called the Civil Corps. It's not entirely dissimilar than the ASD. But it's more of a communications branch of the Army as opposed to intelligence. And so I really got into IT at that point, making systems work, communications, et cetera. But then I got this really neat opportunity to work at IBM and apply for a position within their penetration testing team. Right? So I applied, I got the job, and I was an ethical hacker. Right? It's the time that was what it was called. It became known as penetration testers, but we broke into systems and we told people how we broke in and then help them shore up those security vulnerabilities. From there, I moved. I wasn't a very good pen tester. Usually their frame of reference is a bit more creative than mine. I'm a very linear thinker, unfortunately. With a military background, I was much better suited for forensics. So I moved into the forensics team, had a deep understanding of how systems work, as well as how hackers worked. And so I actually became a pretty good forensics investigator, ended up writing 2 books on the subject, spent 13 years forensics investigator with the U.S. Army, IBM, Trustwave, and I was on special assignments during my time at Trustwave to the United States Secret Service. So I got the opportunity to train the Secret Service in what's called their Electronic Crimes Special Agent Program, also an expert witness in prosecutorial cases for the Secret Service. And I got to be an adjunct professor of cybersecurity, teaching investigative methodology in cybersecurity at Southern Utah University in the U.S. And so then I got the opportunity to come work at Nuix. Instead of addressing individual cases, now I get to help design software that investigations, organizations, law enforcement, intelligence, and law firms use all over the world. So really fun journey. This is my favorite part of it where I'm at today.
Mm-hmm. That's a kind of large sort of journey that you've had. And talk to me a little bit more about when you moved from the military into corporate. To be honest, I've had a lot of people on our podcast, in particular in the US, who have been previously in the military and they've sort of moved into more of a corporate sort of role. And it's definitely been an interesting journey for a lot of them, but I'm really keen to hear yours.
Yeah, it's a unique challenge to move from the very linear thinking of the military, which is very hierarchical, task-oriented, and then getting into software industry or just private industry in general, where that level of rigidity isn't necessarily given the same level of deference that it is in the military. And so the challenge becomes, how do you adjust fire, right? How do you take what you've learned and apply it to a completely different corpus of data to become relevant, right? And so one of the things I learned quickly was adaptability and flexibility are tantamount to being successful as a civilian. And so that has held true over my entire civilian career. And I think it's really a missing element with a lot of professionals is, I've frequently heard the statement, well, I wasn't hired for that, or that's not my job, right? It makes my skin crawl every time I hear it, as opposed to having, a continuous growth mindset and looking for ways to increase your knowledge, your skills, and be able to provide an ever-growing value to the organizations that you work for. And so that kind of perspective changes, the way you approach as you make that transition, from the military, as opposed to saying, this is what I'm going to do because this is what I did in the military, versus thinking I learned how to adapt, improvise, and overcome, and I'm going to apply that skill set.
Mm-hmm. So, Chris, when you and I spoke, we discussed your experience about working in a senior position, including being a CISO, and we talked quite in depth about sort of how people traditionally came up through the ranks to becoming a CISO, but then you also sort of raised some areas of improvement that need to happen. So can you discuss your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so historically, there's been a few different paths to becoming a CISO, right? There's the technical path where you are a technician, right? You're adept in security, protocols and technologies, and so you move your way up into the executive ranks by displaying some leadership and capabilities as an executive, and so you become a CISO, right? The advantage there is that you understand the way the technology can play together. The disadvantage is that you don't speak the same language as the rest of your executive colleagues. I knew very little about things like finance, P&L sheets, sales strategies, go-to-market strategies, because I was so singularly focused on security. And so I was at a disadvantage with the rest of my colleagues. I could go deep on what I knew, but my level of understanding about what they knew was very shallow. And so that's a challenge for CISOs that enter the executive ranks through that path. But it's not insurmountable, right? I was able to overcome it, and after 3 or 4 years of kind of intensive study. The second way is that you're an executive in another discipline. You're a general counsel, you're a chief risk officer, and so cybersecurity is seen as another aspect of IT or of risk, and so they put it under an existing executive, right? So the benefits there are that you understand how executives think and work and how to associate different levels of risk and the appetite that the organization has. The disadvantage is that usually precious little about the technology, about how they actually play together, what different terminology means, and how all those things combine to provide a defense in depth strategy for an organization. Right? So there's kind of risks and rewards to both. And then the third is that you don't know a whole lot about either of them, but you find yourself in the role of a CISO. Believe it or not, we've actually seen this happen many times. You may have a sales background, or you may have just been in the right place at the right time, or because of the size of the organization and the maturity isn't quite what it is at bigger companies, you end up in a senior leadership position without much leadership experience or cybersecurity experience. And so that's obviously the most dangerous and the most frightening because you don't know what you don't know, and you end up kind of making some basic mistakes along the way. I was pretty fortunate that I understood the tech first. I have my master's degree in information security. Having been a pen tester and a forensics investigator, I understand how breaches work. I've watched organizations by the hundreds go through data breaches and kind of fumble around and not really know how to respond, and then how to take the lessons learned and apply them to their security strategies. So I was at a bit of an advantage in that regard. But the other aspect, as I said, I had to learn everything else about being an executive. And so it took a few years, but I eventually got to the point of reasonable proficiency.
So where would you sort of say the sweet spot is? Because you sort of spoke about 3 different areas of how people have gotten to be a CISO. Where would you say would be the best fit in terms of overall performing that type of function?
I think it's a combination, right? Personally, I think that having the in-depth knowledge of how the security technologies work is absolutely vital, right? Because without that knowledge, it's very easy to make some pretty basic mistakes about how to protect your organization, what things are important, how to prepare for, regulatory compliance or GRC oversights, right? Those are all pieces of the equation that you learn as you come through the ranks. But then where that sweet spot, I think, resides and where we need to do a better job is incorporating the other aspects of the business into that educational process of those people that are on that journey. Right. So don't wait until you become a CISO to have a conversation with your CFO and understand how departmental accounting works, how go-to-market strategies work, how P&L sheets work, how does your budget factor into the larger budget, how do you equate, the risk appetite of the organization, how does that determine what your budget looks like, how much you have to spend, et cetera. Likewise for other parts of the business, right? How do you operationalize the strategy? What part does security play in that role, right? So all of those different pieces of how an organization goes to market, how it makes money, how it drives revenue, how it maintains sustainability are all absolutely vital for any executive to understand, especially the CISO who doesn't historically live in that space. So the more you're able to converse in the language of your colleagues, the easier it becomes to advance the security strategies and the plans that a CISO lays out, because you're not talking bits and bytes and ones and zeros and firewalls and apples and things that nobody else really care about, but you understand what it is that they care about, right? Very Dale Carnegie. And then how do you translate that into a language then that your peers understand what you're trying to achieve, and then you can go forth and do those things with some kind of minimal resistance.
One of the things that you and I did speak about was technical people sort of maybe starting off as a systems engineer, and I've spoken about this multiple times, working their way up through the ranks, and then all of a sudden they're now a leader, they're a CISO. But then you and I sort of discussed in terms that they sort of just got there by default. Would you say that that's majority of people at the moment who are holding these types of positions that there's kind of been no one else around to take that position, and then all of a sudden Joey is the only guy that they've got and he just has to become the CISO?
Yeah, it's hard to say what the percentages are because there's some fantastic CISOs that are very, very well equipped, and there's some that are kind of in the middle, and then there's some that are completely ill-equipped. So I think without knowing the exact breakdown, it's probably more than would make any of us comfortable, right? And I think the data breach statistics are part of that, right? You can see that, by and large, most organizations aren't great at protecting themselves, and that's corporate, government, banking. It's kind of industry agnostic in that regard. And you can't lay the blame squarely on the CISO's shoulders, right? Because he has other executives he has to liaise with. He's got a board he's got to convince, for his budgetary plans and his objectives, and those, are then, contradiction or alignment with what the rest of the executive team wants to do. So it's certainly a piece of the equation, but not the equation in its entirety. And so I think if you find yourself in that position, you have to kick into kind of an ultra learning mindset and go find as much information as you can, right? And understand what your rate determining step is, with respect to what is the skill that you're lacking, that in learning it will propel you forward, and in not learning it is holding you back the most. Is it finance? Is it, collaboration? Is it understanding go-to-market strategies? Is it sales? Right? There's whatever that piece is that you lack the most, learn that first, and hopefully that will accelerate the rest of your learning. And find someone else that's further down the path, right? Find a mentor, find a coach, find someone who can help you navigate those waters. Because it's not easy. There's lots of CISOs, and there's lots of them that aren't doing all that hot. And I don't think it's a function of intelligence or capability. I just think it's a function of experience, of humility, and being able to put yourself in a position where you're ready and willing to, to learn from your peers, to learn from someone further down the path, and apply those things immediately into your role.
There are companies out there that you've probably already seen that are sort of providing training from a leadership perspective. My question to you would be, one, what do you think of them? But then number two would be, I believe that certain people are sort of born better to communicate than others. So do you sort of think people should just stay in their lane? And do you think a lot of these skills can be trained to the best of their ability to be influential?
Yeah, I absolutely think you can. And I'll use myself as an example, right? When I was younger, I was a horrible communicator. I couldn't read out loud. I stuttered terribly. And in fact, I went to speech therapy all the way through high school. And so I learned how to communicate, and I learned how to present, and I learned how to increase my vocabulary so I wouldn't, stutter on words or get to the point where I wanted to say something I didn't have the vocabulary necessary to communicate those facts. So I absolutely believe that communication is a learned skill. I think most people aren't good at it because they don't practice it. But I don't think it's a limiting factor. And there's, like any skill, some people have a propensity for it, right? And some don't. It requires hard work. But there's a strategy. There's different ways to communicate, and it's definitely something that anyone can pick up, whether it makes them comfortable or not is irrelevant. They can learn it. And so I think from a training perspective, to kind of answer your first question, is I haven't been to any of those classes, so it's hard for me to quantify. I know in my role as a professor, I interact with my students and my peers, and I've guest lectured at universities all over, to include Australia. And where we see the biggest breakdowns aren't in technology, right? It's not in a student's ability or a young executive's ability to grasp the technology. It's in their ability to communicate, right? How do they communicate with their peers? How do they communicate up? How do they communicate to their board, to the executives? And that is both written and verbal communication. Right, as a former investigator, I would read the reports of my peers, or as an expert witness, I would read the reports of other investigators, and it was great data, but it was just communicated in such a haphazard and clumsy way that it took so much effort to read through it to find the information that was necessary to do whatever it is I was trying to do. So I think if we could adjust fire on the educational programs that we have, it's not just the acquisition of the knowledge within the field, but then it's communicating that in a meaningful way to a target audience that probably has no idea what you're talking about, right? So it's really understanding what is that language that they speak, how do you translate what you're trying to get across into a language that they can understand and grasp, and then doing that in a meaningful way that helps you achieve whatever the outcome is you're looking for.
Would you say that people are wanting to learn how to communicate? And I ask this only because there's still this stigma in the industry that, quote unquote, soft skills aren't so important.
Yeah, I just cringe when I hear that, because unless there's a robot uprising and we no longer have to communicate, right? Despite what Black Mirror tells us, that hasn't happened yet. And so I will argue vehemently that is not a soft skill. That is an absolute core competency. I have yet to see a job in the software, or in any industry rather, where communication was not essential. You will always have someone who's reading your reports, someone who's reading your emails, someone you have to convince to give you budget to do the things that you want to do. So you are always communicating and you are always selling, right? It's another thing that I hear that makes me cringe is when people say, well, I don't understand sales. I'm not a salesperson. And my retort is everybody sells everything every day, whether you're dealing with your partner or whether you're dealing with someone on a business development call, or you're trying to get your boss to agree with you and give you some budget to do some stuff. You are selling, and so I think those skills are far more important than we give them credit for. And we have so many students coming out of programs that think that their knowledge of the subject matter is sufficient to allow them to be successful, when it's really kind of the baseline, right? It's the equivalent of the you must be this tall to ride this ride. Everybody should have this degree of technical capabilities within those roles. What really sets apart the good and the great from the average is their ability to communicate with others within the organization and outside of the organization.
I totally agree with you. So I hear all of your points, which I agree with, but then why do you sort of feel that people still go on about like, that person's not technical, I'm technical, and it's sort of a lot of that talk, but then it's very dismissive to people that can communicate and influence? Do you think they feel threatened by that, or they feel intimidated?
No, I think it's intellectual hubris. A couple of my previous roles, I managed large teams of both penetration testers, researchers, and forensics investigators. And these are people, by and large, who their identity is founded in their intellectual capabilities. So being the smartest person in the room isn't just something that they feel like they need to do or want to do. It is so deeply ingrained in their success criteria that they've grown up in the industry with, that it's a part of who they are. I mean, I had it as well, right? You don't mean to have it, but you're in an industry where, if you think about being in professional sports, right? Who's the fastest, who's the strongest, who can kick the ball the hardest or hit the ball the hardest, or whatever sport you're in, that becomes the measuring point of capability and success. In an industry here where it's dominated by tremendously intelligent people, right? You have to assume that kind of competitiveness just shifts from physical prowess to intellectual capability. And so it is absolutely within this industry, the same way it is in the legal industry and in the medical industry. These are some of the smartest people in the world, and they are at the top of their game, right? These are the equivalent of professional athletes who have the hubris about their intellectual capabilities, and it becomes something of a sense of pride, and it also introduces that almost an adversarial relationship of I am better than you because I'm smarter than you, and which is fine. You want that kind of competitive nature, because if you're a hacker, you need to outsmart the defenders. If you are a forensics investigator, you have to outsmart the hackers. If you're a malware researcher, you have to outsmart the malware developers, right? So it's a constant balance between I want you to have enough of that competitive nature that you've got an edge. But I also want you to understand that it's not binary. It's not a zero-sum game. Right? It's not that I am smarter than Carissa, therefore Carissa must be less smart than me. We can both be smart, and we can both attack problems in a collaborative way and benefit from each other's experience and wisdom, as opposed to it being, an either or type situation.
I hear you. So how do you think that we sort of change the conversation of, like you said, it's not a zero-sum game. The technical guy isn't smarter than the person that can speak. The person who can speak isn't smarter than the technical guy. How do you think we can sort of operate in unification towards this problem?
Yeah, there's tons of analogies, right? I played American football when I was growing up. And so, using a sports analogy, using American football, everyone on the team can't be the quarterback. And everyone on the team can't be a lineman. And everyone on the team isn't a wide receiver. Everyone has skills. And everyone has abilities for which they are uniquely gifted. And a team is not those individuals playing as individuals, but taking the skills and the abilities that they have and combining them to create something that they couldn't do individually. Right? It's one of my favorite parts of my role, presently at Nuix is I'm the head of what's called Partner Connect. So I oversee our partnerships around the world. And so the most compelling part of that is the fact that a successful partnership is when two organizations come together to create something unique that neither one could do on their own. And so this concept of building these high-powered teams doesn't mean I have to do what you do or you have to do what I do, but it's what do we do together that in that collaboration we bring something to the table that we couldn't achieve on our own. And that's when you see the greatest teams come together, whether it's sports teams or companies or marriages or whatever the case may be, is when the individuals involved in that realize that the true potential doesn't reside in their individual capabilities, but in the capabilities that the team creates through collaboration. So I think if we start to shift the mindset of, we want you to be who you are, and we want you to bring what you bring to the table every day and bring it hard. But that doesn't mean that the guy next to you or the girl next to you doesn't have something that she brings that's every bit as valuable, that's every bit as important. It's just different. And in those differences is where we find the wild card, right? Is the unique way of thinking, the creative component that is going to launch the business forward, or the team or the marriage or whatever.
So, Chris, from a technical level aside, what do you honestly believe is sort of lacking at this level, but right now, just in your experience? Like, what can people sort of, after they listen to this podcast, what are some things they can take away that they can improve on?
Well, I think the first thing is, I don't want to say the most important, right? So I think these are all important, so in no particular order. Number one, leave your ego at the door. If you truly seek to improve yourself and improve your capabilities and improve your position, you have to embrace a position of humility, where approach situations as if you don't know everything. you're missing information, and it's probably more complex than you think it is, right? And it doesn't mean you have to come across as stupid. It doesn't mean you have to come across as, being ignorant, right? It's more Socratic. It's asking questions. It's making sure you understand it so deeply that you can explain it to a layperson, right? So I think that's kind of step one is adopt that position of humility, and don't think that now is the time to let up, right? Now is the time to put the gas on, right? There's a great book called Relentless by Tim Grover, who used to be Michael Jordan's personal trainer, right? So it's a fascinating book. But the concept is players who would get to the NBA would think I've arrived, and they would back off. And so if you take that example and you shift it over to the executive ranks, becoming a leader is when you should put the gas on. And this isn't the time to coast and to kind of rest on your laurels, but this is the time to suck up as much information as you can, because you have a fiduciary responsibility, right? You wear what's called the mantle of leadership now, which if you picture the image of that, literally sitting on a leader's shoulders, to be as good as they can be, to learn as much as they can, to provide as much value to their organizations as they can, because everyone within that organization that is relying on you to lead them and to lead the organization are kind of banking on your abilities to make good decisions and to be wise in your judgment and in your counsel, right? So that's kind of number two. And then I think the third one is find a mentor, right? Find someone who's further down the path that can guide you. That you can ask questions to, that you can be in a safe environment where you don't got to feel like you're asking something stupid, or there's tremendous value in having a mentor that has been where you are, just a bit further down the path, that can share, their wins and wisdoms and how it is that they circumnavigated the challenges they have and how did they get to where they are. I'm very, very fortunate both to have an executive coach who is absolutely fantastic, and a boss that's been in the industry for more than 40 years who is very kind enough to share all of his information, with me and all the wisdom he's gained over the years. And then the last piece of that is the application of that wisdom, right? I heard once that it's easy to mistake 10 years of experience for 1 year of experience repeated 10 times, because you're not extracting the wisdom from those experiences that you should, to really give them the value that they should have in your life and in changing your perspective. So experience is not a function of time, and experience isn't the best teacher. Wisdom is the best teacher that has to be extracted from the experiences you go through, so that you can then apply that back to your, back to your life in a meaningful way, and in your leadership, capacity in a meaningful way, so that you get better. And every day is, you're on this journey to improve. Incremental improvement, as John Maxwell calls it, where you're better yesterday than you were today, and you're going to be better tomorrow than you are right now. So, or the way around. Sorry, you're better today than you were yesterday, better tomorrow than you are today.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of mentors, you mentioned that you're doing some coaching for CISOs. So talk to me a little bit more about this.
It's a fantastic opportunity, and I've been able to coach a few different CISOs and some other executives in very specific areas. Right? I clearly don't know everything, but within my area of expertise, it's the application of leadership principles, what I've called in the book that I'm actually working on that we talked about before, which is called From Tech to Exec. It's learning how to make the transition from an individual contributor to a leader. There are leadership programs that teach certain aspects of it, but again, when you talk about the soft skills, I don't view those as soft skills. The ability to communicate, the ability to read people, the ability now in this world to understand cultural differences and how they play into how that other person perceives what you're saying, how you're sitting, the clothes that you're wearing. These are all parts of that journey that need to be taken into consideration to be an effective leader. Now, I don't think they're going to make you a great leader, but they're certainly not going to introduce additional roadblocks that you're going to have to navigate. And so that's tremendously important as you move forward. So being able to coach them on understanding how to learn, right? It's kind of something we didn't learn in school, right? We were taught rote memorization and taught memorize these things, regurgitate them on the test, and move on, as opposed to how do we apply what's called the ultra learning, principles. Scott Young wrote that in his book of the same title. But how do we prioritize our learning activities in such a way that it yields the outcomes that we're looking for. And what are those outcomes? And what's the rate determining steps in those outcomes in which I have a particular skill that if I get will accelerate my growth in other areas. And if I don't get it, it's holding me back. And so the CISOs that I've been able to work with are fantastic in their areas. They're deep subject matter expertise, very, very smart men and women that just I'm a bit further down the path. And so helping them to understand how to communicate in languages that they don't speak, right? How do you speak CFO? How do you speak board? How do you speak HR or people and culture? And these are all different aspects of leadership that an executive is going to have. And then once they become CISOs, now what? What do you need to learn to truly be good at your job? What does it mean to be a great CISO? What skills are required to get you there? Right? Most don't think about that. They think I've arrived. I'm at the pinnacle of my career as a security professional. Where do I go from here? And my challenge, much like Tim Grover said to his clients in the NBA, this is where the journey starts. You've become a CISO. That's awesome. You can now begin the journey because there's a lot here. There's a lot to learn, and it's going to be a whole lot of fun if you embrace that continuous learning mindset.
So would you say that when people, as you mentioned, once they have arrived, and I love that way that you phrase it, would you say that a lot of people think, well, I've kind of arrived now, I'm just going to sit back and just ride the wave? Would you say that would be what most people's mindset is, but then they sort of are quick to realize, well, actually, I've got to keep learning and evolving and adjusting?
Yeah, I think it's the default position, and I don't think it's unique to any specific individual. I think it's human nature. We're sort of inertia creatures, right? Once we're at rest, we tend to stay at rest, but once we're in motion, man, it's pretty fun to stay in motion. And so I don't think the issue is one of capacity or capability, right? Because, everybody has the same 24 hours in the day, which means if I can read, 5 books a month, so can you. It's just I choose to use my 24 hours differently. And so it's understanding, well, what are your objectives, right? Is your objective to show up for work every day, do the bare minimum possible, and then go home, right? It's not the kind of person I want to coach, and I would question that's not the kind of person any organization wants as a leader. Versus I don't want to be good at my job. I want to be great at my job. I'm going to spend more time here than I spend with my family. I have everyone in the organization that's relying on me to make sound and timely decisions, to help to guide the business. It's their livelihood at stake, right? Mortgages, kids, partners, college, tuitions, everything that goes with that. So there's a tremendous weight on our shoulders as leaders. And so if you want to be truly good at what it is that you do, then let's help define that. What does that look like for you? What does success look like? What does the expansion of your knowledge and of your wisdom? What is that going to do? And then you can prioritize. Well, here's the things I need to do to get there. Right? It's directed learning. It's not going to a class and memorizing some stuff. It's figuring out, well, how does finance and the knowledge of how money works, how does that factor into being a CISO? Because I guarantee you it does. How does reading people's body language, factor into being a CISO? Because it absolutely does. How does understanding how to pivot and be flexible? How does understanding sales cycles, go-to-market strategies, business, continuity, risks, alliances, partnerships, collaboration, all of those things are part of the CISO's world. But if you're not exposed to that corpus of knowledge, you won't ever think that your role goes beyond protecting the organization. That is an absolutely critical role, and it's the reason CISOs exist, but it's not the only component. And there's a whole lot of other stuff there.
So what I'm curious to know now is, you've talked about all of these things, which I agree with, but what do you think needs to change from a leadership perspective in order for our industry to evolve?
It's really interesting. It's something I've thought about quite a bit. And I think first we need to define evolution, right? What do you mean by that, right? Technology is advancing, capabilities are advancing, right? So are we talking about technical evolution, or are we talking about not getting breached so much, right? Clearly that's going on a lot, or is it other types of evolution that are unique to different industries, right? So we need to kind of pin that down first. And the way I'll define it, right, is as a security practitioner and having been in the field for a long time, it's our ability to detect threats faster, respond to those threats once we detect them faster, and then be able to perform those investigations to prepare for either, some sort of litigation where, we're going to get sued, or there's going to be a class action lawsuit, or we have, breach of contract to worry about, or there's some sort of government oversight of inquiry that we have to prep for. So there's from the endpoints at deflection and detection all the way through to, anticipation of litigation. And so the evolution of that becomes, can we reduce the amount of time? Let me step back. Can we deflect more? Right. So do we understand attacker, methodologies sufficiently to be able to deflect an increasing number of attacks? Of the more sophisticated attacks that break through, can we detect those faster, and then subsequently perform investigations? So that's technical evolution. But then the understanding from a human perspective is, who are the human beings doing all of those things? And I'm trying to remember the statistics, they escape me at the moment, but there's hundreds of thousands basically of cybersecurity jobs in the world that are going unfilled because we just don't have the bodies to fill them. And so the danger there becomes, are we going to end up filling them with warm bodies as opposed to the right body, right? The old adage of Mr. Right versus Mr. Right now. And so that becomes part of the evolution, is how do we educate this next generation of cybersecurity professionals better? And then the last piece of that is, how do we get the right leaders in place to build the kind of culture that's going to attract the top talent, that's going to allow the operationalization of the strategic vision? So you have to have the vision of how to protect the organization, the people to do it, the technology that allows them to do it. And all of those things, I think, hinge on the leader. I don't think there's ever been another time in history where technology has been more ubiquitous, right? Moore's law has essentially gone vertical. And so the distinguishing characteristic is becoming less and less about the technology and more about the creativity and the capabilities of the people using it. And so I think that's where, in my mind, we need to see more of an evolution, is the leaders that are part of the organizations understanding more about the human elements, about communication, not treating those things as soft skills, but treating them as essential components to the success of the organization. Right? The example that I actually use in my book is the Tower of Babel. Right? Whether you believe the biblical story or not is irrelevant. Right, of all of the things that could have been taken away from the people of Babel, it was their ability to communicate. So all construction came to a halt. Their ability to build the tower stopped, and it could have been, any of the plagues. It could have been locusts. It could have been fire from the heavens. It could have been anything. But the story, God chose to use communication. So communication stops, everything dries out, and I think that's a great. That's a great analogy to apply to business today. It is about skills, and it is about who's got what capabilities, but it's more so about the ability to communicate upwards, downwards, side to side, right? And so I think that's the evolutionary change that we need to see, is stop treating these things like soft skills, make them absolutely essential, right, to students, student curriculum, and of management training capabilities to understand how humans work, how to influence behavior, and most importantly, how do you communicate in a language that you may not truly understand.
So just last thing on that, I know you sort of mentioned it before around your book that you are still writing, I believe. So talk to me a little bit more about Tech to Exec. Just provide a little bit of a synopsis of what can be covered in it, so when it does get published, people can go and grab a copy.
Yeah, this is the hardest book I've written. This is my third. My first two were textbooks about forensics investigations. One of them was Unix and Linux forensic investigations. The other one was data breach preparation and response. And so this is a whole lot more research than I had anticipated, which is good, right? And I've got a coach who taught me the concept of killing my darlings. And so I write a chapter, I think it's good, and then I cut half of it out and go write it again. So hopefully I get to the point of I move past the law of diminishing returns and actually come out with a good book at the end. But the concept is in my journey, going from an individual contributor to an executive, I learned a whole lot along the way. And fortunately, I had an executive coach who was absolutely amazing, who helped me pick up skills that I didn't even know existed, and read books that I never even heard of. Now, without him, though, I would have never have made those connections. I didn't know who Patrick Lencioni was or John Maxwell. I didn't know who Simon Sinek was. I didn't know who Benjamin Noakes-Caceres was, or Ed Cattrall. So in learning about the skills that were necessary and reading about them, I was able to expedite my journey. And so I wanted to find a way to communicate that to people going through the same thing, right? And it's actually been something interesting as I've been talking to other executives about it, or other people who are moving up the ranks, or in doing research with other executives or other CISOs, I found that it's a common theme, right? There really isn't any good literature on how do I make this transition? What are the things I need to be aware of? What are the good things that I need to do? And what are the not so good things I shouldn't do? Guiding that journey is what Tech 2 Exec is all about. It takes the reader from a place of, okay, I was an individual contributor yesterday, and now I'm going to be an executive tomorrow. The rules have changed. The game has changed. My peers have changed. Their motives have changed. Everything that made me good at my job has now changed. And it's a very unnerving feeling. And to be honest, a bit frightening. And so understanding that you're not the only one, to go through that is kind of step one. And then understanding what does that upside down pyramid look like, right? Because the more you move up towards the, where the base would historically be, the more you realize you don't know, and the more you realize you have to learn. And then it goes into recommendations of books. It goes into recommendations about, ways to have conversations with your peers and with your fellow executives about their success criteria and how do you define what those relationships need to look like, and then a bunch of recommendations about other books to read because it's clearly not going to be an all-encompassing book, but we're going to point you in a lot of directions about the books that I've seen. Right? I don't read 5 a month. I wish I did. I read about 2 to 3 books a month, and have for probably the last year, maybe 18 months. And so the books that provide the most insights and kind of the best information to help you build that frame of reference quickly, and then understanding how your brain works, how you learn as an adult, what are the neurological aspects of that, so that you're not just reading and forgetting 5 minutes later, right? But you're actually retaining greater portions of what it is that you read, so that you can then either recall it or be able to find it quickly and then apply it to whatever situation you're in. So I'm probably 50% of the way there. I'm hoping to have it finished by the end of the year.
Wow. Okay. I'm definitely will be getting a copy for myself. So Chris, again, I really appreciate your time. I really enjoyed chatting with you and talking through your experiences and your opinions. If people would like to ask you a question that perhaps I didn't ask you myself, how can I go about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. You can email me. I am Chris.Pogue, P-O-G-U-E, like Vogue with a P, at Nuix, Nuix.com. I answer my email pretty much all the time, so happy to respond wherever you may be in the world. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to help people out that are on the same path.
Well, again, Chris, I really do appreciate it and your time today. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Carissa, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks for tuning in. As always, we hope you got some new ideas or ways of thinking from this episode. And remember, you can always reach out to our guests if you do have more questions. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, and we always love to hear your feedback. So leave a review on iTunes and we might just give you a shout out on a future episode. You can find me on LinkedIn as well as on @IamCarissaBreen on Twitter and Instagram. And if you'd like to know more about how we help tech companies, check out CarissaBreenIndustries.com. Until next time, stay safer.